The signal came through just after midnight. A single message, terse and routine, passed through field communications and disappeared into the noise of 1,000 other operational updates coursing through Allied headquarters that night. No alarm bells. No emergency sessions. No formal approvals sought or granted. Just confirmation that units had begun moving into position along a river whose name most staff officers would have struggled to pronounce correctly. By morning, it would be done. By the time anyone with the authority to question it had fully absorbed what was happening, the crossing would be complete. Bridges erected. Infantry across. Armor rolling through. A fait accompli delivered not through defiance of orders but through the careful exploitation of their absence. Nothing about this violated protocol. That was the genius of it. There had been no explicit prohibition, no directive saying wait, no line drawn in the operational sand. The move existed in that narrow space between initiative and insubordination, a space that combat commanders had learned to navigate with the precision of safecrackers. But initiative, however brilliant in execution, carries consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. And this particular initiative, launched in darkness with impeccable tactical justification, would detonate a crisis that had nothing to do with the enemy and everything to do with the alliance itself. What happened that night wasn't recorded in any formal decision log. No meeting minutes captured it. No authorization bore a signature. It simply occurred, as if the momentum of war itself had made the choice, leaving human authority to catch up after the fact. And that is precisely what made it so dangerous. Because in coalition warfare, where national pride wears a uniform and historical destiny hangs on every headline, the question of who moves first can matter more than the movement itself. Victory has authors. Glory has claimants. And when the narrative of triumph is still being written, arriving early to the final chapter can be the gravest miscalculation of all. This is the story of a river crossing that nobody opposed. Of a military success that created a strategic disaster. Of the moment when the question stopped being how to defeat Germany and became how to defeat each other without firing a shot. Nothing broke that night. But something fundamental shifted. And by the time the sun rose over cold European water, the hierarchy of the Western Alliance had already begun its quiet, irreversible transformation. The decision that was never logged would reshape everything that followed. The Allied command structure in early 1945 presented an image of disciplined coordination that belied the complexity of its construction. 3 years of combined operations had forged a machinery of cooperation that functioned with remarkable efficiency despite incorporating military cultures that had evolved on separate continents with fundamentally different assumptions about warfare, authority, and national destiny. Maps covered the walls of SHAEF headquarters, marked with careful precision. Unit positions updated daily. Supply lines traced in different colors. Objectives marked and remarked as the front contracted westward. The visual language of total organization, of a machine too large and too sophisticated to be derailed by individual impulse or national vanity. Command meetings followed established rhythms. Intelligence briefings delivered with practiced formality. Operational updates presented according to standardized formats. Decisions emerging from consensus, or at least from the appearance of consensus, which in coalition warfare amounts to the same thing. The British had brought their tradition of meticulous planning, of operations conceived months in advance with every contingency mapped and every resource calculated. Monty's staff could tell you the fuel requirements for an offensive 3 weeks hence, the ammunition stocks needed to sustain it, the casualty estimates that would shape decisions about reserves. The Americans had brought industrial scale and an operational philosophy that valued aggressive momentum over elaborate preparation. Speed mattered. Initiative mattered. The ability to adapt faster than the enemy could react. Planning had its place, but no plan survived contact with opportunity. These approaches coexisted uneasily but productively. The tension between them had proven creative more often than destructive. Montgomery could complain about American recklessness. American commanders could grumble about British caution. But the system held because both sides understood that the alternative to cooperation was chaos. Eisenhower sat at the center of this machinery, not as its engineer but as its diplomat. His genius was not tactical or strategic in the conventional sense. It was political, in the highest meaning of that word. He understood that his primary task was not defeating the Wehrmacht but managing an alliance that could defeat the Wehrmacht. The distinction mattered enormously. Formal agreements governed nearly everything. Zones of advance carefully delineated. Responsibility for sectors assigned through negotiation. Major operations subjected to approval processes that involved not just military leadership but political oversight from London and Washington. The entire elaborate structure designed to ensure that no single commander, no matter how brilliant or bold, could unilaterally determine the shape of victory. This system had brought the Allies from Normandy to the Rhine. It had absorbed setbacks and capitalized on breakthroughs. It had bent under the strain of competing egos and clashing philosophies but never broken entirely. In early 1945, as German resistance collapsed along multiple fronts, the machinery appeared to be functioning exactly as designed. The final offensive into the heart of Germany had been mapped, debated, approved. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood the sequence. The great orchestrated finale would unfold according to plan, with each national contingent contributing to a victory that belonged to all. The illusion of control was nearly perfect. And perhaps if you are still watching, still following this thread, you have already sensed what comes next. Perhaps you recognize that moments of apparent order, especially in war, often precede the most significant disruptions. Stay with this. The architecture of what seemed permanent is about to reveal cracks that no amount of staff work could repair. The philosophical divide had been present from the beginning, masked by the urgency of common survival but never truly resolved. Two fundamentally different theories about how modern war should be waged, both validated by experience, both championed by commanders whose records made their confidence non-negotiable. One school held that victory emerged from systematic preparation, from accumulating overwhelming force at designated points, from ensuring that when the blow fell, it would be decisive because every variable had been calculated, every contingency addressed, every supporting element positioned for maximum effect. War is engineering problem. War is industrial process. Success guaranteed not by brilliance but by thoroughness. This approach had liberated North Africa. It had made Normandy possible. It had broken the Siegfried Line through methodical pressure that ground German defenses into dust. Its adherents could point to results measured in square miles secured and held, in enemy formations systematically destroyed, in objectives taken and consolidated. The other school believed in tempo, in maintaining pressure that prevented enemy recovery, in exploiting opportunities the moment they appeared rather than waiting for perfect conditions that might never arrive. War is a living organism, constantly shifting, demanding constant adaptation. Success achieved not through the elimination of risk but through moving faster than risk could materialize. This approach had driven the breakout from Normandy. It had achieved the impossible distances of the race across France. It had repeatedly caught German commanders preparing for battles they assumed would come tomorrow, only to find Allied armor already in their rear today. Both philosophies were correct. That was the problem. In a smaller war, or a war fought by a single nation, these competing theories might have been resolved through institutional hierarchy. One general would prevail. One approach would dominate. Doctrine would crystallize around proven success. But in coalition warfare, especially between powers of roughly equal contribution and nearly equal pride, neither side could claim absolute authority. The British pointed to their longer experience, their institutional memory of 2 world wars, their understanding of European geography and politics that no amount of American energy could replace. The Americans pointed to their scale, their industrial capacity that made Allied victory mathematically inevitable, their fresher thinking unburdened by the traumatic memories that made British commanders see threats around every aggressive maneuver. The debate never occurred openly. That would have been unseemly, divisive, potentially destructive of the alliance itself. Instead it played out through deployment decisions, through the allocation of resources, through careful negotiations about objectives and timing that always carried unspoken subtext about whose vision of warfare would define the final campaign. By March 1945, the tension had evolved into something more specific than abstract philosophy. It had crystallized around a river, around timing, around the question of who would cross first and what that crossing would represent. The Rhine was not just terrain. It was symbol. The last major natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The river that had defined European history, that had marked the edge of Roman Empire, that appeared in myths and operas and nationalist literature. To cross it was to begin the end. To cross it first was to claim authorship of that ending. Plans existed. Elaborate, detailed, negotiated plans about when crossings would occur and where and in what sequence. Plans that distributed opportunity with careful equity, ensuring that national prestige would be served even as military necessity was met. But plans exist on paper. Opportunity exists in the moment. And when those two things diverge, when the map and the terrain suddenly refuse to align, command philosophy stops being abstract and becomes intensely, dangerously concrete. The shift was subtle. No single meeting marked it. No declaration announced it. But somewhere in the weeks before the crossing, the question had transformed. It was no longer about the best way to defeat Germany. It was about tempo. About who controlled the rhythm of advance. About whether the war would end according to schedule or according to opportunity. This was the unspoken competition. The rivalry that could not be acknowledged because acknowledging it would require admitting that the alliance had fractures deep enough to matter, that cooperation had limits, that victory might belong more to some than others despite every public statement to the contrary. And into this carefully balanced tension, maintained through endless diplomatic effort and mutual restraint, the events of late March would drop like a stone into still water. The crossing at Remagen had been unplanned fortune, an opportunity that materialized when no one expected it. A bridge intact when bridges were burning. American units pouring across before German demolitions could drop the span into cold water. That had been March 7th. Lucky, chaotic, gloriously improvised. This was different. This was deliberate. The 21st Army Group had been preparing for weeks. Montgomery's forces positioned along the Rhine's western bank with the sort of methodical precision that characterized everything he commanded. Stockpiles accumulated. Bridging equipment assembled. Assault troops trained for the specific challenges of river crossing under fire. The entire elaborate machinery of a set-piece operation wound tight and ready. The agreed timeline called for late March. Coordination with American forces to the south. Synchronized pressure across multiple crossing points. The kind of comprehensive offensive that looked impressive on maps and sounded decisive in press briefings. But rivers do not wait for schedules. And reconnaissance does not always yield the intelligence commanders hope for. On the night of March 23, elements of the British Second Army began crossing the Rhine near Wesel. Quietly. Efficiently. Without the massive preliminary bombardment that had been planned. Without the elaborate coordination that had been promised. Without, crucially, the formal notification that protocol demanded. The formal notification that protocol demanded. The operation was tactically flawless. Assault boats slipped across dark water with minimal opposition. Engineers erected pontoon bridges with speed that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not watched British sappers work under fire for 6 years. By dawn, infantry had secured the eastern bank. Armor was rolling across. A bridgehead established with casualties far lower than worst-case projections had suggested. It worked too well. That phrase matters. Success has gradations, and sometimes the completeness of success creates problems that failure would have avoided. If the crossing had been contested, if German resistance had required the full weight of planned support, if the operation had unfolded according to the careful schedule that everyone had agreed to, then its legitimacy would have been unquestionable. But it had happened early. It had happened quietly. And it had happened, from the perspective of other Allied headquarters, without warning. The operational justification was sound. Enemy positions weakened by weeks of bombardment and tactical pressure. Intelligence suggesting that German units in the sector were under strength and demoralized. A window of opportunity that might close if postponement allowed reinforcement. Every reason why a field commander, granted initiative within his sector, might reasonably decide to move when conditions favored movement. Except that this was not a routine tactical decision. This was the Rhine. This was the beginning of the end. And the decision to begin that end belonged, according to every understanding that had been carefully negotiated over months of planning, to more than one man's assessment of conditions on the ground. The news filtered through communications networks with the peculiar velocity of information that everyone suspects might be significant but no one wants to be first to escalate. Initial reports treated it as routine. British units engaging enemy positions along the Rhine. Expected contact. Normal course of operations. Only gradually did the full scope become clear. This was not probing. This was crossing. This was bridgehead establishment. This was the operation, launched ahead of schedule and without the coordination that the word operation implied when applied to coalition warfare at this scale. The sun rose over the Rhine to find thousands of British and Canadian troops on the eastern bank, digging in, expanding their perimeter, preparing to receive the armor and artillery that would make the position permanent. A fait accompli, executed with the sort of professional competence that made complaint seem churlish even as the strategic implications began to crystallize in headquarters hundreds of miles away. No speeches accompanied it. No press releases announced it. No grand declarations marked the moment. Just the quiet efficiency of units doing what they had trained to do, when their commander decided the time had come to do it. The problem, as would become clear in the hours and days ahead, was not failure. Failure would have been simpler to address, easier to contextualize within the normal friction of war. The problem was that premature success, success achieved outside the framework of agreement, success that rewrote the narrative of who was driving the final campaign, could undermine months of careful political choreography. Winning too early, it turned out, carried costs that had nothing to do with military effectiveness and everything to do with the stories nations tell themselves about their role in history. The first communications arrived before breakfast at SHAEF headquarters. Routine initially. Updates on overnight operations. Nothing flagged as requiring immediate attention from senior leadership. Then clarifications began. Follow-up messages providing additional detail. Scale of the crossing. Number of units committed. Extent of bridgehead already established. Someone put the pieces together. Someone recognized that what was being described was not a probe or a preparatory action but the main effort itself, launched without the coordination that main efforts required. The realization spread through the headquarters with the particular quality of bad news in military bureaucracies. Not panic. Not shock. Just a quiet intensification of attention, a shift in the tenor of conversations, a sense that something significant had occurred while everyone slept and now consequences would need to be managed. Eisenhower received the news with the careful neutrality that had become his signature response to information that threatened alliance cohesion. No immediate reaction. No visible anger. Just questions, delivered in that Kansas flatness that could mean anything or nothing depending on context. When had the crossing begun? What forces were committed? What objectives secured? Had there been prior notification through proper channels? The answers to the first three questions were satisfactory from a purely military standpoint. The operation had been well executed. Objectives achieved. Casualties light. By any tactical measure, a success worth celebrating. The answer to the fourth question was more complicated. There had been communication. That much was not in dispute. But communication is not the same as coordination, and coordination is not the same as approval. Messages had been sent. Information had been shared. But the sequence and timing of that sharing, the specificity of what had been conveyed and when, left room for interpretation about whether this represented proper procedure or careful exploitation of procedural ambiguity. In practice, senior Allied headquarters had learned of the crossing after it had already succeeded. The news had arrived not as a request for approval or even as advance notice of imminent action but as confirmation of accomplished fact. This was not, strictly speaking, a violation of orders. No orders had explicitly forbidden it. But the absence of prohibition is not the same as authorization, especially in an alliance where the understanding had always been that major operations would be coordinated, that timing would be synchronized, that the final push into Germany would be something undertaken collectively rather than seized unilaterally. The anger, when it came, was controlled. Professional. Expressed through proper channels in the proper language of military diplomacy. But it was real. American commanders, particularly those who had spent months planning their own Rhine crossings and carefully positioning their forces to execute those crossings according to the agreed timeline, looked at maps that suddenly showed British forces already across, already consolidating, already claiming the initiative for the final campaign. The question was not whether the crossing had been militarily sound. The question was what it meant. What it signaled about the command relationship. What it implied about who was actually directing the final phase of the European war. Bradley, commanding American ground forces, received the news with the sort of quiet fury that comes from feeling outmaneuvered not by the enemy but by an ally. His forces had been positioned to cross. His operations had been planned. His contribution to the final victory had been carefully calculated to ensure that American sacrifice would be reflected in American achievement. And now British forces were already across, their success already being reported, their accomplishment already shaping the narrative about who was driving toward Berlin. Patton, never one for diplomatic restraint, made his feelings known more colorfully. The crossing represented, in his view, exactly the sort of careful positioning and preemptive action that turned coalition warfare into a competition for glory rather than a coordinated destruction of the enemy. But the reaction that mattered most was quieter, more measured, and ultimately more consequential. It came not from field commanders but from the political leadership that oversaw them, leadership that understood that military operations in the final months of war were inseparable from the political architecture that would follow victory. Churchill received word of the crossing with satisfaction that he made no effort to conceal. British forces across the Rhine first. British initiative driving the final campaign. British arms demonstrating once again that experience and professionalism could achieve what enthusiasm and industrial scale could not guarantee. This was not merely about tactics. This was about Britain's place in the post-war world. About ensuring that the nation which had stood alone in 1940, which had bled through 6 years of total war, would not be relegated to junior partnership in the final victory. The crossing represented vindication. Proof that British arms remained decisive. Evidence that the war's endgame would bear British fingerprints as clearly as its beginning had. And if American commanders felt slighted by the timing, if Allied coordination appeared to have broken down, well, wars were won by those who seized opportunities when they appeared, not by those who waited for permission that might never arrive. The tension that had been theoretical, that had existed in competing philosophies and unspoken assumptions, suddenly became concrete. The crossing had worked. But it had worked in a way that violated the unwritten rules about how coalition partners were supposed to behave. And those rules, it turned out, mattered more than anyone had been willing to admit while they remained unbroken. Perhaps you are beginning to see why this moment matters. Why a successful military operation could generate a crisis that had nothing to do with its military outcome. If you are still watching, still following this thread, stay with it. Because what happens next reveals something fundamental about power, about alliances, and about the difference between winning battles and winning the narrative of victory. When strategy becomes status, the battlefield becomes the least important terrain. The Rhine crossing had succeeded militarily. That fact was never in dispute. British and Canadian forces controlled the eastern bank. The bridgehead was expanding. Follow-on units were crossing without significant opposition. By every tactical and operational measure, Montgomery had achieved exactly what he had set out to achieve. But wars between great powers, especially wars fought in coalition, are never purely military events. They are performances of national capability. Demonstrations of political will. arguments about the future conducted through the medium of organized violence. And in those terms, the crossing represented something more complex than a successful operation. It represented a claim. Not a claim to territory. Germany would be defeated regardless of who crossed which river when. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. The outcome was not in question. But the meaning of that outcome, the interpretation that would be carried forward into the post-war world, the story that would be told about who had been essential and who merely helpful, that remained very much in play. Churchill understood this with the clarity that came from leading a nation whose global position was eroding faster than public rhetoric could acknowledge. Britain had begun the war as the dominant power in Europe, the center of an empire that spanned continents, the nation whose financial and military resources made coalition leadership a natural assumption. 6 years later, that position was increasingly fictional. British industry had been mobilized beyond sustainability. British cities bore scars that would take decades to heal. British finances depended on American credit to a degree that made the phrase independent power something of a historical artifact. The post-war world would be shaped by those who could project power, who could sustain massive military establishments, who could underwrite reconstruction and deterrence and the entire expensive architecture of global influence. Britain could still do these things, but barely, and with costs that would require choosing between empire and solvency. America could do them almost casually, with industrial capacity that had expanded during the war while British capacity had been consumed by it. The crossing mattered because it was visible. Because it generated headlines. Because it allowed Churchill to tell the British public and the watching world that British forces had been first across the Rhine, that British leadership had driven the final campaign, that Britain remained what it had always been, essential, decisive, victorious. This was not vanity, or at least not merely vanity. This was strategic communication about relative power, about who should have voice in shaping post-war Europe, about whether Britain would enter peace negotiations as a great power or as America's distinguished but diminished associate. The Americans saw it differently, but not entirely differently. Washington had its own narrative requirements. American forces had crossed the Atlantic and turned the tide of a war that British courage alone could not win. American industry had built the ships and tanks and aircraft that made victory possible. American casualties, while fewer than Soviet or British losses, still numbered in the hundreds of thousands. American mothers had buried sons in European soil. That sacrifice demanded recognition. Not merely symbolic recognition but acknowledgement that the war's outcome reflected American strength, that the peace would reflect American priorities, that the balance of power had fundamentally shifted across the Atlantic. Roosevelt, exhausted and dying, still understood that the European endgame mattered enormously for American credibility. The United States had entered both world wars reluctantly, had demobilized rapidly after the first, had maintained that isolationism right up until Pearl Harbor made it impossible. The post-war settlement would need to justify permanent American engagement in European security, would need to establish American leadership as natural rather than anomalous. And that narrative became harder to sustain if the final campaign appeared to be driven by British initiative, if American forces appeared to be following rather than leading, if the cross-Atlantic alliance looked more like Britain directing American strength than America rescuing European weakness. So the Rhine crossing, however tactically justified, however operationally brilliant, detonated tensions that had been building since Normandy, since North Africa, since the first moments when American and British staffs began planning combined operations and discovered that cooperation required suppressing fundamentally different visions of post-war order. The dispute expanded rapidly beyond the immediate question of who had crossed when. Messages flew between headquarters. Formal communications expressing concern about coordination procedures. Less formal communications expressing frustration about initiative that seemed designed more for political effect than military necessity. Montgomery, confronted with American displeasure, responded with characteristic confidence. The operation had succeeded. Enemy forces had been defeated. The Allied advance had been accelerated. If the timing had been inconvenient for some, well, war rarely proceeded according to everyone's preferred schedule. This was not quite insubordination. Montgomery had not violated explicit orders. He had exercised initiative within his command authority. He had made a tactical decision that proved correct. The fact that this decision carried political implications was hardly his responsibility. His job was winning battles, not managing Allied sensitivities. But this response, however defensible in narrow terms, missed the deeper issue. Or perhaps did not miss it but chose to ignore it, gambling that success would validate methods and that complaints about procedure would fade once the war ended. The gamble was partially correct. The war would end. Germany would be defeated. The alliance would hold together long enough to achieve its primary objective. But the cost of that early crossing, the price paid for premature success, would be calculated in currency that had nothing to do with tactical victory and everything to do with the permanent alteration of command relationships, national prestige, and the quiet but irreversible shift in who would actually direct the post-war world. The letters grew sharper. The cables more pointed. Each exchange raised stakes, made explicit what had been implicit, forced into the open tensions that productive ambiguity had previously managed. From one general to another, questions about coordination that were really questions about authority. From political leadership to military commanders, reminders about alliance unity that were really warnings about whose vision would ultimately prevail. Bureaucracy became battlefield. The real conflict was not being fought at the Rhine anymore. It was being fought in carefully worded paragraphs, in the precise language of diplomatic frustration, in the subtext of messages that said one thing formally while meaning something quite different strategically. And at the center of this expanding dispute stood Eisenhower, the man whose entire purpose was to prevent exactly this kind of rupture, now confronted with the reality that successful coalition command might not be possible when the stakes involved not survival but the distribution of victory's rewards. Eisenhower occupied a position that combined immense formal authority with almost no actual freedom of action. Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force. The title suggested unlimited power, the ability to direct armies according to purely military logic, to make decisions based on tactical advantage and strategic necessity without regard for political complication. The reality was infinitely more constrained. He commanded forces that belonged to different nations, answered to different governments, represented different historical traditions and different visions of post-war order. His authority derived from their willingness to accept it, a willingness that depended on his ability to balance competing interests in ways that left everyone feeling adequately represented. The Rhine crossing had disrupted that balance. Not destroyed it. Not yet. But disrupted it sufficiently that the entire command structure now required recalibration, and every option for recalibration carried costs that could permanently damage something vital. He could reprimand Montgomery. Assert authority. Make clear that such unilateral action would not be tolerated again. This would satisfy American commanders who felt their forces had been upstaged and their planning undermined. It would demonstrate that Supreme Command meant something more than symbolic coordination. But it would also humiliate Britain's most prominent general at the moment of his greatest recent success. It would validate every British suspicion that American leadership meant British subordination. It would hand Churchill a crisis that could unravel months of careful diplomacy about post-war cooperation. He could publicly celebrate the crossing. Emphasize its military success. Frame it as evidence of Allied capability and initiative. Minimize the coordination questions as procedural details irrelevant to the larger achievement. But this would leave American commanders believing that their concerns did not matter, that political considerations would always override military professionalism, that the alliance operated according to rules that benefited some partners more than others. He could quietly reorganize command authority. Shift responsibilities in ways that reduced Montgomery's autonomy going forward. Create additional oversight mechanisms that would prevent similar unilateral action. But this would be obvious, transparent, and insulting. It would signal publicly what everyone was trying to avoid admitting, that the alliance had fractures deep enough to require institutional correction, that trust had broken down, that coalition warfare now required safeguards against coalition partners. Every option damaged something. That was leadership in coalition command. Not choosing the right answer but choosing which wrong answer would do the least permanent harm. Eisenhower spent hours with maps that told him nothing useful. The military situation was clear enough. The Rhine had been crossed at multiple points now. Patton had sent his own forces across shortly after Montgomery, deliberately, some thought vindicatively, ensuring that no single commander could claim singular achievement. The advance into Germany proceeded along multiple axes. Resistance varied but nowhere held decisively. The war, in purely military terms, was proceeding toward its inevitable conclusion. But the question that consumed Eisenhower's attention had nothing to do with the Wehrmacht. It was about the alliance. About whether the cooperative structure that had been painstakingly constructed could survive the transition from fighting for survival to competing for credit. His staff offered analysis that crystallized the dilemma without resolving it. The British perspective was not without merit. Montgomery had assessed conditions correctly. The crossing had succeeded with minimal casualties. Delaying for perfect coordination might have allowed German reinforcement. Initiative in warfare deserved protection even when it created friction. But the American grievance was equally legitimate. The understanding had been that major operations would be synchronized. The Rhine crossings were not routine. They marked a strategic threshold. Acting unilaterally, whatever the tactical justification, violated the spirit of coalition warfare even if it did not violate its letter. And underlying both positions was the unspoken reality that this was about more than one operation. It was about whether the final phase of the war would be perceived as primarily British or primarily American in character. Whether victory would reinforce British claims to continued great power status or confirm American ascendancy as the dominant Western military force. History would remember what was simple, not what was careful. A dramatic crossing, accomplished first, generated headlines that meticulous coordination could never produce. The public narrative was being written in real time, and that narrative would shape post-war perceptions of who had actually won the war, whose sacrifice had been decisive, whose leadership would naturally continue into the peace. Eisenhower understood this. He had spent the entire war managing exactly these dynamics. But understanding and resolving are not the same thing. And as March turned toward April, as the alliance drove deeper into collapsing Germany, the question of how to address the Rhine crossing remained unresolved because every resolution carried costs that made hesitation seem like wisdom. The private reckoning came not in a formal meeting but in a quiet conversation whose details would remain largely undocumented but whose impact would prove decisive. Eisenhower and Bradley, away from staff, away from the formal apparatus of command, discussing what could not be discussed through official channels. The crossing had succeeded. That fact shaped everything else. Military logic suggested that success validated the decision to cross. Political logic suggested that validating the decision validated the unilateralism that had produced it. Bradley posed the question that reframed the entire argument. If Montgomery had failed, if the crossing had been repulsed, if casualties had been catastrophic, would the coordination failure matter more or less? The answer was obvious and damning. It would matter more. Failure achieved through unilateral action would have been unforgivable. Eisenhower would have had no choice but to relieve Montgomery, regardless of political consequences. The alliance could not function if commanders risked troops without coordination and produced disasters. But success achieved through unilateral action created different pressures. Success made discipline harder to enforce because enforcement looked like punishing victory. Success shifted the debate from whether the action was proper to whether the complaints about it were petty. Speed had already decided the future. That was Bradley's insight, delivered without drama but with complete clarity. The crossing had succeeded. The bridgehead was established. German forces were in retreat. The final campaign had begun with British forces leading it, and nothing Eisenhower could do now would change that fact or alter the narrative it created. Pride just had not caught up yet. American pride was wounded, British pride was inflated, but both were responding to something that had already concluded. The argument was not about what should happen next. It was about how to feel about what had already happened. And feelings, however legitimate, however understandable, could not reverse time or modify accomplished facts. The conversation revealed the truth that Eisenhower had been avoiding. His authority was real but limited. He could not undo the crossing. He could not erase the headlines. He could not redistribute credit retroactively. All he could do was decide whether to make the alliance's internal tensions explicit through formal reprimand or leave them implicit through careful silence. Making them explicit might satisfy American commanders, but it would damage British morale and give Churchill a grievance that would complicate every subsequent negotiation about post-war Europe. It would establish precedent that initiative, however successful, would be punished if it inconvenienced alliance politics. Leaving them implicit would frustrate American commanders but preserve the facade of unity. It would allow the war to end without public rupture. It would leave the question of who really directed the final campaign deliberately ambiguous, which was perhaps the only sustainable answer to a question that had no resolution both sides could accept. This was not the choice any general wanted to make. It was not the sort of decision that military training prepared officers to confront. But it was the decision that coalition warfare imposed on anyone unlucky enough to command forces whose national identities mattered more than their operational utility. No shouting marked the conversation. No dramatic pronouncements. Just two professionals acknowledging that the ideal solution did not exist and that the available options ranged from bad to worse to catastrophic. What emerged was not a decision so much as an acceptance. The crossing had happened. Its effects could not be contained. The alliance would absorb the disruption because the alternative was collapse, and collapse was unacceptable with Germany not yet defeated and the Soviet question looming over every conversation about post-war security. Eisenhower would not formally reprimand Montgomery. He would not publicly celebrate the crossing either. He would let it stand as accomplished fact, neither endorsed nor condemned, preserved in the ambiguous space where inconvenient truths resided when making them explicit would damage interests more important than clarity. This satisfied no one completely. That was how you knew it was probably the right choice. American commanders would grumble but continue fighting. British commanders would claim vindication but understand that similar initiatives would face different reception now that the precedent had been established. The alliance would hold because all parties understood that the alternative to holding together was losing separately. And when the war ended, when histories were written and memoirs published, the Rhine crossing would be remembered as a brilliant tactical success rather than a strategic crisis, which was exactly the sort of quiet victory that Eisenhower specialized in, preventing disasters that no one would ever know had been threatened. The war demanded results, not fairness. That principle, unstated but understood by anyone who had commanded in coalition, governed the resolution of the Rhine crisis. Montgomery's crossing would stand. American objections would be noted but not acted upon. The alliance would move forward not because the tensions had been resolved but because resolving them mattered less than winning the war. On April 12, Roosevelt died. The news reached Allied headquarters with the force of strategic catastrophe, briefly overwhelming all other concerns. The crossing, the command disputes, the questions of credit and narrative all suddenly seemed smaller against the reality that the Western Alliance had lost its primary political architect in the final weeks of war. Truman assumed the presidency with limited knowledge of Allied planning and even less experience with the delicate balance that Eisenhower had been maintaining. The transition created uncertainty that affected every calculation about post-war arrangements, about Soviet relations, about the degree to which British concerns would continue to shape American policy. But it also created opportunity for a kind of reset. The disputes of March belonged to the previous administration. Truman could begin his tenure without inherited positions, without the need to defend decisions he had not made. The Rhine crossing, in this new context, became historical rather than current. Something that had happened rather than something requiring response. The crisis deflated not through resolution but through supersession, overtaken by events that made yesterday's tensions seem less urgent than tomorrow's challenges. Montgomery proceeded to orchestrate precisely the sort of set-piece operation he had always preferred. Operation Plunder unfolded with massive preparation, overwhelming force, and minimal casualties. The Rhine crossing became a textbook example of methodical warfare, validating every principle Montgomery had advocated throughout his career. but the headlines had already been written. The dramatic moment had already passed. Plunder succeeded brilliantly and was reported routinely. Success, it turned out, was less newsworthy than surprise, and thoroughly planned operations generated less attention than bold improvisation. The grand operation still unfolded successfully. British and Canadian forces drove deep into northern Germany. Objectives were taken on schedule. German resistance, sporadic now and increasingly disorganized, could not prevent the systematic reduction of remaining pockets. Yet the narrative belonged elsewhere. Patton had ensured that American forces crossed the Rhine in multiple locations, often with minimal planning, maximum speed, and casualties that suggested either remarkable luck or divine favor. His operations generated exactly the sort of dramatic reporting that careful preparation could never inspire. Armor racing through collapsing defenses. Infantry advancing so quickly that supply lines struggled to keep pace. The American style of warfare, aggressive and improvisational, producing results that looked effortless even when they required extraordinary capability. The contrast was inevitable and damaging. British professionalism versus American dash. Careful planning versus bold initiative. Both effective, both vindicated by results, but generating very different impressions about which approach better suited modern warfare. Montgomery's success was too complete to be interesting. Everything worked exactly as planned. No dramatic complications. No last-minute adaptations. Just the systematic application of overwhelming force to achieve predetermined objectives. Militarily impressive. Journalistically boring. American operations, chaotic and improvised and sometimes verging on reckless, generated the stories that newspapers wanted to print and readers wanted to consume. Generals racing to be first across. Bridges seized by small units before they could be demolished. Armor columns driving through the night to cut off retreating Germans. The war as adventure, as demonstration of individual initiative, as proof that courage and speed could achieve what careful planning required weeks to accomplish. The narrative belonged to those who moved fastest and made it look easy. That was not Britain. Could not be Britain, given British resources and British caution born of 6 years watching carefully trained men die in operations that went according to plan right up until they did not. Excellence, Eisenhower understood, did not guarantee recognition. The best executed operation in the war might be forgotten if it generated no surprises, if it concluded exactly as briefed, if it demonstrated competence rather than brilliance. This was the wound that the Rhine crossing had inflicted, and that subsequent operations could not heal. British forces had crossed first, but American forces had crossed more dramatically. British planning had been vindicated, but American improvisation had been celebrated. The final campaign bore signatures from both nations, but the headlines increasingly emphasized American achievement while treating British contribution as competent but expected. This was unfair in every military sense. British forces fought with extraordinary skill. Canadian units in particular distinguished themselves repeatedly. Montgomery's methodical approach minimized casualties while maximizing certainty. By any professional standard, the British contribution to victory was essential and deserving of recognition equal to American efforts. But wars are not remembered according to professional standards. They are remembered according to stories. And the stories that emerged from the final campaign, the narratives that would shape popular memory and influence post-war perception, increasingly centered American action while relegating British forces to supporting role. Churchill felt this acutely. He had stage-managed the Rhine crossing precisely to generate headlines that would remind the world of British military significance. The crossing had succeeded. The headlines had appeared. But they had been overwhelmed by subsequent American operations that better fit the narrative templates that journalism preferred. The image that defines memory is rarely the most important moment. It is the most visible moment. The most dramatic moment. The moment that can be reduced to a photograph or a sentence or a myth simple enough to survive the complications of actual history. For the Rhine crossing, that image was not Montgomery's methodical professionalism. It was Patton's racing columns. It was American infantry crossing with minimal preparation. It was the sense of inevitable momentum, of forces that could not be stopped because they moved too quickly to be caught. That these images were partially illusory, that they obscured the careful logistics and planning that made dramatic operations possible, mattered not at all. Perception was reality when it came to national prestige. And the perception emerging from April 1945 was that American forces were winning the war while British forces were participating in it. May brought surrender. The war in Europe ended not with dramatic climax but with administrative process, signature on documents, formal capitulation that felt anticlimactic after 6 years of total mobilization. Victory celebrations filled streets in London and New York. Crowds gathered to cheer returning troops. Headlines proclaimed the end of Nazi tyranny. The machinery of total war began its awkward, uncertain conversion to peace. But within the alliance, the Rhine crossing's effects continued to metastasize in ways both subtle and profound. Montgomery's reputation, secure before the crossing, had not been enhanced by it. The operation's success was acknowledged. His professionalism was never questioned. But the controversy about timing, the friction with American commanders, the sense that he had prioritized British prestige over Allied coordination, all of it accumulated into a narrative about difficult allies and prima donna generals that would follow him into retirement. This was deeply unfair. Montgomery had made a tactical decision based on conditions as he assessed them. The crossing had succeeded. German forces had been defeated with minimal friendly casualties. By any military standard, he had performed exactly as a field commander should perform, seizing opportunity when it presented itself. But coalition warfare operated according to standards that were not purely military. And by those standards about consultation and coordination and the preservation of alliance unity, the crossing represented failure however much it represented tactical success. American commanders emerged from the controversy with their positions strengthened. Bradley's steady professionalism had been contrasted favorably with Montgomery's perceived grandstanding. Patton's aggressive operations had generated headlines that made Montgomery's careful planning seem timid by comparison. The final campaign had established, in ways that were never formally acknowledged but widely understood, that American forces would lead any future coalition operations and that British participation, however valued, would be subordinate rather than equal. This shift was not dramatic. No single decision or announcement marked it. But it was visible in how post-war planning proceeded, in who shaped the occupation arrangements for Germany, in which voices carried weight during the conferences that would determine Europe's future. Churchill fought rearguard actions throughout the summer of 1945, trying to preserve British influence in decisions about Poland, about Greece, about the architecture of post-war security. Some of these efforts succeeded. Britain retained significant voice in shaping the peace settlement. But the trajectory was clear. American power, economic and military, would define Western policy going forward. British wisdom might inform decisions but American capacity would determine them. The Rhine crossing had not caused this shift. That would be too simple, too dramatic. The shift reflected structural realities about industrial capacity, population, economic resources. Britain had mobilized beyond sustainable limits. America had barely begun to tap its full potential. The post-war balance of power reflected those underlying facts more than any single operational decision. But the crossing had made the shift visible. Had crystallized in one dramatic moment what had been emerging gradually over years. Had demonstrated that American forces could move faster, adapt more readily, generate better headlines than their British counterparts. Had established narrative patterns that would persist long after tactical details were forgotten. Careers altered. Montgomery would command British forces through the occupation but his influence over Allied strategy was permanently constrained. Eisenhower's reputation, challenged by the crisis, emerged strengthened. He had held the alliance together through its most dangerous internal dispute. He had prevented rupture without allowing indiscipline. The skills that made him effective as supreme commander, political more than tactical, would carry him eventually to the presidency. Reputations froze in patterns established by the Rhine controversy. Montgomery is brilliant but difficult. Eisenhower is diplomatic sometimes to the point of weakness. Bradley is steady and reliable. Patton is aggressive and sometimes insubordinate but producing results that justified tolerance. These characterizations were simplifications, caricatures that captured elements of truth while missing complexity. But they stuck because they fit narratives that people wanted to believe about national character and military style. The power balance inside the alliance shifted permanently not through any formal restructuring but through accumulated small changes in who deferred to whom, who consulted whom, who could act unilaterally and who required approval. British commanders found themselves increasingly subject to oversight that American commanders escaped. Plans required British approval but American objections carried veto power. The vocabulary of equal partnership remained but the reality had become something else. This was not dramatic. Not sudden. Just irreversible. The long shadow of the Rhine crossing extended through the decades that followed. NATO command structures reflected lessons learned about coalition management. American leadership was formalized rather than assumed. Coordination procedures were elaborated to prevent the sort of unilateral action that Montgomery had executed. The alliance's architecture encoded the understanding that had emerged from March 1945, that coalition warfare required subordinating national initiative to collective decision-making, even when individual initiative might produce superior tactical results. Montgomery himself would reflect bitterly in later years about American sensitivity and wounded pride. He had crossed the Rhine when conditions favored crossing. The operation had succeeded brilliantly. German forces had been defeated. Allied advance had been accelerated. That American commanders had felt upstaged was, in his view, their problem, not his. But this missed the deeper point, the lesson that Eisenhower had grasped even if he could not articulate it without offending someone. Coalition warfare was not primarily about defeating the enemy. It was about maintaining the alliance long enough to defeat the enemy. Those were related goals but not identical ones. Sometimes the requirements of alliance maintenance conflicted with optimal military strategy. And when they conflicted, alliance maintenance had to prevail because armies could recover from tactical setbacks but alliances rarely recovered from perceived betrayal. The Rhine crossing had demonstrated this principle in ways that shaped how Western democracies would conduct coalition operations for the next 80 years. Initiative mattered. Speed mattered. But coordination mattered more, even when it slowed operations, even when it produced suboptimal results, because the alternative was the collapse of cooperative frameworks that made victory possible. The final reflection came not from generals or politicians but from historians trying to make sense of a moment that seemed simultaneously insignificant and decisive. The Rhine crossing had not changed the war's outcome. Germany would have been defeated regardless of who crossed when. The operation's success or failure would not have altered the trajectory of a conflict already in its terminal phase. Yet something important had shifted. Something about power and perception, about who controlled narratives and who shaped memory, about the transition from one kind of world to another. This was not about personalities, however much individual commanders contributed to the crisis. Montgomery's ambition and Patton's competitiveness and Churchill's desperate need for visible British achievement all played roles. But they were symptoms of larger forces, structural changes in global power distribution that would have manifested somehow regardless of individual choices. What the Rhine crossing marked was the end of an era. The final moment when British military action could plausibly be presented as equal to or more significant than American contribution. The last time that British initiative could shape a major campaign's narrative without explicit American approval. The war that followed would be American in character. The occupation of Germany would reflect American priorities modified by British input rather than British priorities supported by American strength. The post-war security architecture would be built on American military capacity with British participation welcomed but not essential. This transition had been inevitable. Britain had exhausted itself holding Germany at bay from 1939 to 1941 while America watched. That early sacrifice deserved recognition, deserved gratitude, deserved respect. But it did not change the mathematics of power that shaped the post-war world. The Rhine crossing accelerated the transition without causing it. made visible what had been gradually emerging. Forced into the open tensions that productive ambiguity had previously managed. Created a moment that crystallized the shift from British leadership of the Western Alliance to British participation in an alliance led by others. The future belonged to those who moved first. That was Montgomery's justification for the early crossing, and it was partially correct. Speed mattered enormously in warfare. Initiative could decide battles, campaigns, sometimes wars. But the future also belonged to those who could sustain speed, who could maintain initiative not for weeks but for decades, who could project power globally without exhausting their industrial base or bankrupting their treasury. And by that measure, by the measure that would actually determine post-war order, the future belonged to America regardless of who crossed the Rhine first. Empire's plan. Superpower's move. That distinction, crystallized by the Rhine crossing, would define the next 8 decades of Western military strategy. Britain planned brilliantly. British staff work was meticulous. British operational art was sophisticated. British generals understood European warfare in ways that American commanders, for all their energy and resources, could not quite match. But planning required time, required consultation, required the accumulation of resources that Britain increasingly could not afford. Moving required capacity that Britain no longer possessed and America had in surplus. The ability to act decisively, to project force globally, to sustain operations indefinitely without economic crisis, all of that depended on industrial and financial resources that the war had redistributed across the Atlantic. The Rhine crossing was the moment when that redistribution became undeniable. When the pretense of equal partnership could no longer be maintained even for diplomatic purposes. When everyone involved understood that the alliance would continue but its character had fundamentally changed. Victory was shared. That was important. British forces fought with extraordinary courage and skill through the final weeks of war. Canadian units distinguished themselves repeatedly. The liberation of northern Germany was achieved through British competence and professionalism that deserved unlimited recognition. But the narrative of victory, the story that would be told and remembered and taught to subsequent generations, that narrative belonged primarily to American forces whose operations generated better headlines and whose contribution could be measured in resources that Britain simply could not match. This was the cost of the early crossing, the price paid for success achieved outside the framework of coordination. Not military defeat. Not tactical failure. But narrative subordination. The quiet but permanent shift from leading to supporting, from shaping to implementing, from empire to influence. And perhaps that shift was inevitable. Perhaps no single decision, however different, could have altered trajectories determined by industrial capacity and economic strength. Perhaps the Rhine crossing simply made visible what was already occurring, gave form to transitions that structural forces had already determined. But the manner of transition mattered. The grace with which one era yielded to another. The preservation of dignity even in decline. The ability to participate meaningfully in the new order rather than being relegated to honored irrelevance. The Rhine crossing made that transition more difficult, more visible, more painful than it needed to be. It damaged relationships that might have eased the shift in power. It created grievances that would persist long after military necessity had faded. It established patterns of American dominance and British subordination that were never intended but became embedded in institutional structures that would outlast the generation that created them. The moment you need permission to keep up, you are already behind. That reality, unstated but understood by everyone involved, hung over every subsequent negotiation about alliance structure, about command authority, about who would lead and who would follow in the wars and crises that followed victory in Europe. Britain would remain important. Would remain valued. Would remain a crucial American ally whose counsel shaped decisions and whose capabilities contributed to collective security. But would never again be equal, never again lead, never again define the Western Alliance's character and direction. The Rhine crossing did not create that reality. But it made that reality unmistakable, undeniable, and permanent in ways that shaped everything that followed.